as well as India, and even strange and exotic places like State College, Pennsylvania. So it's a really international group that we've gathered together today. I would ask you, those who feel comfortable with it and are able to do it, to mute your audio and turn on your video. I ask that because it's more pleasant to look at people instead of name tags. But there's a more practical reason, and that is when I tell a joke, I need to have the crowd reaction, because having failed at diplomacy and academia, I'm now thinking about a third career try, and that's stand-up comic. So it's good to have the ability to know whether my jokes are getting any response. Even though I can't hear you, I can at least see you. So the topic today is the Iran nuclear deal. And while it's important in its own right, I thought it would be, I think it illustrates something about the way foreign policy is made. And I don't think just in the United States, it's probably more generally true, but probably perhaps not quite as true as it is in the United States. And again, it's a topic of a book I wrote. I wrote a book about the whole thing, because what interested me, and I will now go to the dreaded screen share, what interested me was what the Iran nuclear deal, I mean, the content and the process and everything, I found interesting. But what I thought was more interesting was what it said about how foreign policy is made. Now, if you look at textbooks, you get a explanation of the world, which if you're a practitioner, you kind of scratch your head and say, really? I mean, do you really think that's the way that things are done? Excuse me. So this one textbook that I looked at, it's the 6th edition of this textbook. And of course, textbooks are rewritten and come out with new editions, not because there are enough changes to justify a new edition. It is the publishing industry's way of making sure that the used book market does not take away or reduce their profits too much. So they keep coming out with a new edition, which is even more expensive than the previous edition. So this book called Perspectives on International Relations, it says this book will show the students how theories of international relations play a decisive role in explaining the debates about world affairs. And I think one thing that I stress in my classes is that you shouldn't necessarily think of foreign policy as somehow distinct or different from domestic policy. There was a senator, a Republican senator, excuse me, named Vandenberg, who was an isolationist before World War II, and then after World War II, he saw the need for a robust American role throughout the world. And so he coined a phrase that went something like politics stops at the water's edge. And what he meant by that was that that domestic politics, the arguing between Republicans and Democrats, et cetera, that goes on every day, should not extend to foreign policy. That when we go out and into the world, we should do it as American foreign policy, not a Republican foreign policy or a Democrat foreign policy. Of course, that's not the case today, but the problem with saying foreign policy is somehow subject to theories of international relations is to assume it's different from domestic policy. If you had someone stand up and say, okay, I have a theory for how domestic policy is made, and it's going to explain everything. And you'd say, well, this person clearly doesn't know what they're talking about, because domestic policy is made on the basis of politics. It's the people involved get in, push and shove, and try and influence the policymakers. And the result is, as Bismarck, the German statesman of the 19th century, early 20th century, once said, people who have weak stomachs should not watch policy, government policy, and sausage made. So it's this sausage making process that I think characterizes foreign policy as well as domestic policy. And also, one of the other things that the theories never talk about is personality, personnel, process, and participation. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. So the Iran nuclear deal, the acronym was JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It took 20 months to negotiate. It's 31,000 words. It was not just the United States versus Iran, it was the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, the ones with the veto power, the winners of World War II, plus Germany on one side of the table, or for a while they called it the EU 3+3 because there was France, Britain, and Germany, and then Russia, China, and the United States, and then on the other side of the table, Iran. And of course, now you have the EU 2+1 plus another 3, I guess, because now that Britain has dropped out of being in part of Europe. I guess the English Channel got wider at some point. So I think what the deal does is illustrates how the influence of money, technology, partisan politics, and a growing disregard for the truth, plus globalization, has complicated the process of foreign policy making. And as I said, there's my quote from Bismarck. It used to be in, let's say, the 19th century, early 20th century, foreign policy was made by a couple old white men in dark suits behind closed doors, having discussions with each other and making decisions. Mr. Sykes and Mr. Pico, for instance, they sat down with a map of the Middle East and drew it up. That, of course, we are stuck with the results today, as those countries are areas that don't really have all that much in common with the people living there, or still have to be constrained by those borders and act like they have some national identity. So what's different from the past? I think the money question in the United States, being a capitalist country, we believe in an open market to buy and sell politicians. And so there's something called Citizens United is a Supreme Court decision that happened about 10 years ago, I believe, where the Supreme Court in its wisdom said free speech can be unlimited amounts of anonymous money poured into political campaigns. Now, normally when I think of free speech, I think of my ability to say what's on my mind and not get arrested. Well, most of the time I won't get arrested, but the Supreme Court decision said, okay, if a corporate CEO, for instance, who has control over millions and millions of dollars that he can direct toward political causes, then he can do that in unlimited amounts, and it can be kept secret. It's dark money. And so that, to my mind, how can free speech be unlimited amounts of money, and how can it be anonymous? But anyhow, I'm not on the Supreme Court, unfortunately. I could use the job, but it's good for lifetime too. So that's one thing, I think. And now the elections in the United States are a multi-billion-dollar industry. When Senator McCain and Senator Obama ran against each other for the presidency, together they spent $1 billion. When Romney ran against, 4 years later, ran against Obama, who was seeking re-election, they each spent $1 billion. And so the price of our elections has gone up. And the problem with that, of course, is that once you create a multi-billion-dollar industry, you have a lot of people making a lot of money. And so they are very resistant to any changes that would threaten their ability to continue to make that money. So, and now you have the partisan politics, this divide between Republicans and Democrats, and it's demonstrated this morning, earlier this morning in the wee hours, the stimulus bill that President Biden wants to pass to spend government money to help people through the coronavirus pandemic and have our economy recover faster. 50 senators from the Republican Party voted against it. 50 senators from the Democratic Party voted for it. And the Vice President Harris got to cast the tie-breaking vote. And so the stimulus package was approved. So just one demonstration, you would think that as something like dealing with the economic impacts of the coronavirus, that you would have some agreement that would cross party lines, but no, apparently not. So the technology part of it is now we have all this social media, we have all the ability to communicate with one another, which is one of the reasons why we have this event right now with people from Europe and India, as well as the United States. But part of that is Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg is a very rich man, and he, like most billionaires, doesn't think he's rich enough. So he wants you to stay on Facebook, to spend your life on Facebook, because he will be able to sell more ads. He'll be able to tailor those ads to things that you've indicated you want or might be interested in. He will tailor your news to things that excite you and other things that you indicate you're interested in. So Mark Zuckerberg's goal is to have the entire world spend all its time on Facebook. And that way, he'll be very rich. Of course, we won't produce anything that he might be able to buy with all that money, because we'll all be on Facebook. But actually, I'm not on Facebook. Don't intend to be. The other problem is post-truth. Or untruth. It's become an industry, basically. You can make money off of lying to people. Again, like Mark Zuckerberg, if you set up a website and people visit that website, that's all that matters. Then you can sell ads and then you can make money. And it doesn't matter if you're spreading the truth or ridiculous lies. And of course, we have this phenomenon in the United States, which I don't understand really, called QAnon. Yesterday in the Congress, the Democratic majority with 11 Republicans, so there were a bipartisan effort. So of the 210 Democrats, or whatever it is, 220 Democrats joined by 11 Republicans, voted to strip one of the Congresspersons of their committee assignments, which basically means that that person goes to Congress every day and has nothing to do, because most of the work of Congress is done in committee. Why did the Congress take that drastic action? It was a Republican Congresswoman from Georgia who engages in this QAnon conspiracy theory. For instance, the QAnon and this Congresswoman in the past has said they believe that forest fires in California were started by a laser in space owned by Jews. So, if you're going to believe that, I'm afraid that A, you're probably anti-Semitic, but B, there's probably no hope for you. You live in a parallel universe from the reality that I see. But one thing that hasn't changed is that elected officials, political appointees, so you have people that are elected their office. Obviously, the president is elected by the whole country, senators by states, House of Representatives by congressional districts. They have their motivations and reasons, like this woman from Georgia. She's elected from a very rural part of Georgia, which is not a particularly sophisticated state, except for Atlanta. And so it's a constituency, I guess. Maybe stupid people need their representatives too. And I shouldn't say stupid, maybe uninformed people who don't have any real contact beyond the next county with the world need their representatives too. But they have one perspective. They appoint, now President Biden is in the process of appointing people to high-level positions in the State Department. So those are not career people, they're people appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. And then you have the career people who spend their careers in government. And so all of those people, that they're not the same. They don't think the same. And of course, then you have academics who like to come up with theories about how the world works. And it doesn't really matter whether the theories work or not. I once did a paper with a colleague, and I thought the paper actually explained something, explained how people get to be ambassadors in the United States, some of them. And it got rejected by a number of journals, a number of academic journals. And one of the common comments for rejecting it was, well, there's no theory here. And I thought, well, it explains the way the world works. But my colleague finally said, well, I'm going to put in a theory. And I said, okay, what theory are you going to put in? And he said something like, oh, I'm going to put in the principal agent theory. And I said, okay, but that has nothing to do with the way that world works, nothing to do with the way the process actually functions. And he said, got to have a theory. So I said, okay, go ahead, you do it. And he did it. We resubmitted it to a journal and it got published. So I think that, theory is nice, but one shouldn't get too confident. So one of the things that affected the Iran nuclear deal is the perspective of the countries with regard to the relationship between America and Iran. When we look at Iran, it's about the takeover of the embassy when the Shah fell, and those 55 hostages were held for 444 days. And there was a movie about it recently called Argo, where the Canadians helped some of the people who weren't taken hostage from the embassy. They hid them, and then the CIA arranged an elaborate plot to pretend they were all part of a movie being filmed, and they flew in, put the embassy people that had not been taken hostage in as part of the crew of the movie, and shipped them out of the country. From the Iranian point of view, it was the fact that the CIA helped overthrow their prime minister, Mossadegh, that we supported the Shah, which had its secret police who tortured people, the Savak. In 1988, one of our warships, the Vincennes, shot down an airplane. The airplane, the Vincennes, thought that this airplane was heading toward the ship, descending in an attack mode. The reality turned out to be it was a commercial airliner on a scheduled route that was going up in altitude and going away from the ship. But they fired a missile and killed 290 people. And then we sided on the war between Iraq and Iran. We sided with Iraq, gave it lots of assistance, and that ended up killing about 1 million Iranians. So they have their version of history. And this is a very busy slide about what the Iran nuclear deal did. Basically, I don't need to go through all of this, but basically it gave them $100 billion in Iranian frozen assets. In return, Iran had to put constraints on its nuclear program. that would give some assurance that it was not using that program to develop nuclear weapons. It had the capability of doing that. If you have centrifuges, you can enrich uranium to about 5% and use it in a power reactor. You can enrich it to about 20% and use it for medical purposes, or you just keep those centrifuges running and you can enrich it to about 96%. And if you get 20 pounds or so of that stuff together, then you got the basic ingredients for a bomb. That doesn't end the challenge. You've got to detonate it, and you've got to deliver it. When Donald Trump was running for president, somebody asked him what the nuclear triad was, or about the nuclear triad. And I think he thought that the nuclear triad was FedEx, UPS, and DHL, because he didn't know how nuclear weapons are delivered. They're delivered by submarine launch missiles, by bombs dropped from aircraft, and by intercontinental or shorter range ground missiles. So basically, the whole purpose of it was to give this confidence that the nuclear program, Iran, like any country that signs the NPT, can have a nuclear program as long as they use it for peaceful purposes. And so that was the whole purpose of the deal, to give confidence that if it had a nuclear program, it would not be used for weapons. And so they got rid of some of their heavy water plant, many of their 2/3 of their centrifuges. And so the estimate was that if they decided today to build a bomb, it would take them a year. Whereas if before the deal was signed, it would only take them 3 months to run the centrifuges, et cetera, get the stuff required to do a bomb. So what's changed since January 20th? I mentioned the personnel process, participation. The personality, I think, I think there's no better demonstration of the importance of to a world leader of someone's personality. And obviously, Joe Biden doesn't look at the world or at government in the same way Donald Trump did. I think the people that Biden has chosen so far are all professionals with long experience in government. Donald Trump was the first, not only president, but the first candidate of the two major parties to be a candidate for president who didn't have 1 minute of experience in government, in elected office, or in the military. And people thought, well, I like him because he's going to change things and he'll learn on the job. Well, he didn't change all that much, and nothing that I can remember for the good. And he didn't ever display any capacity for on-the-job training or on-the-job learning. The process, again, how policy decisions are made has to be organized. And if you have an organized process and a National Security Council that organizes it, then they can say, okay, this is the issue. Here is what the State Department thinks. Here is what the Pentagon thinks. Here is what the Commerce Department thinks. This is what the National Security Council recommends. Now, Mr. President, you need to decide. But I think the process basically was Trump would call into his office a bunch of people, some from the government, other people. You had this man who is now known as the Pillow Man. He makes pillows, and he has these pillows that he advertises on television. Buy my pillow and you'll have the best night's sleep ever. Well, the Pillow Man was going into the White House with a list of things, and they had pictures of him carrying a slip of paper that said, impose military rule, overthrow the election, and all, So yeah, I mean, he was the kind of people and of course Rudy Giuliani and these other strange people. And so they'd all get in the room and shout at each other. And there's a very interesting description of one of these meetings on Axios by a guy named Jonathan Swan that came out a couple of days ago. And it was but beyond bizarre. But anyhow, you have to have a process. And if you've been in government, you know the importance of that, and you know the importance of picking the right people. Not only did Trump have no experience, but who did he name as his first Secretary of State? Rex Tillerson, a man who had not a moment's experience in government, not a moment's experience in elected office. The only time he spent in uniform was when he was a Boy Scout. He didn't spend any time in the military, and so and he was the head of ExxonMobil, and therefore had more money than God and could travel around the world and hobnob with Putin, and the head of the government in Equatorial Guinea and things like that, and make deals to dig holes in the ground and extract oil. But in my own mind, my question that I continue to debate was, who was the worst Secretary of State of all time? Was it Tillerson, or was it the man that followed Tillerson? I haven't decided yet, but anyhow. And then the participation is, each of the two parties have groups that they listen to. And so that's their base voters, and so they have to respond, and those are not the same, and therefore those groups are going to have different influence on policy. So this is why the critics didn't like the nuclear deal. Again, too much information here. Basically, they don't think it gave absolute assurance that Iran wouldn't cheat. And that if we ease sanctions, Iran was going to become more aggressive, and that if they killed the deal, it wouldn't lead to war. Basically, they were just not happy with having a absolute foolproof 100% assurance on the that Iran would not use its nuclear program for nuclear weapons. So the thing that when I went into the Foreign Service, which was 1972, back before any of you were born, or most of you, that we got exactly one lecture on negotiation in the 6-week course, the initial training to be an American diplomat. And the one thing I remember from that lecture was the lecturer asked, "What is the outcome of a good negotiation?" And we said, "Oh, well, to win, to impose your view, to etc." And he said, "No, the outcome of a good election is that you give the other side something that they can take back to their capital and defend. Because if they can't, and they go take the deal back to their capital and it gets shot down, then you don't have a deal. Or even if it is respected for a while, it probably is not going to be respected for long. So if it's a negotiation, as I said, it's not an exercise in domination, subjugation, humiliation, capitulation, retribution, castigation, etc., etc. And it's not a means to bring about regime change, which is what people like Bolton really want. John Bolton, the man who was National Security Advisor for a while and then got fired. And then, as I said, you both have to, both sides have to have something that they can defend and see an advantage to. So what's changed in terms of the Iran nuclear deal? Once the deal was negotiated and signed, in the process of trying, and even before it was signed, in the process of preventing or attempting to influence the Congress could have voted against the deal and made it impossible for even though the 2 years of negotiation that the Obama team spent to come up with a deal, it could have been negated by the Congress saying, you know, we're passing this law against the deal. So in this process, and again, the reason I got interested in it is because it wasn't you know, experts talking behind closed doors and coming up with a foreign policy. It was right out there in the open. And once an issue gets a high public profile, then in a democracy, anybody can weigh in and express their opinions. And we all know that we're all equal, except for those of us who are less equal and those who are more equal. And so one of the things that you see these days in the United States and elsewhere is that people with lots of money who have made billions of dollars think that they have a right to influence government policy. I mean, if you've made $1 billion, I calculated once, if you were worth about 12 or 13 billion dollars, and I hope many of you are, I hope you'll endow Nimra University when you make that money. But if you're worth 12 or 13 billion dollars, if you put that in the bank and earned interest on it in U.S. government treasury bonds, very safe investment, and if you did nothing else but get up every day and spend $1 million, you could give it away, you could throw it out the window, you could buy cars and houses and boats, whatever. If you'd have to spend $1 million a day every day of the year, it wouldn't matter how long you lived. When you died, you'd have more money than when you started with, because you couldn't even consume the interest of $1 million a day if you were worth 12 or 13 billion dollars. Somebody like Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, is now the first centibillionaire, meaning his fortune is now estimated at more than $100 billion. So you can imagine, in fact, he's just announced his retirement. So I guess he's going to go and retire, because he's going to have to spend at least $10 million a day every day before he even reduces his fortune at all. So on the Iran nuclear deal, you had a lot of billionaires weighing in, giving money to defeat the deal. You had the first person, Sheldon Adelson, was a casino billionaire. He died recently. He was very rabidly pro-Israel and gave money to Israel. He once suggested that we should drop a nuclear weapon in the desert of Iran and blow it up just to show that we mean business. That was his approach to diplomacy. And so all of these people with their billions of dollars were contributing some of that money to defeat the deal in the first group there. And then you had billionaires on the other side. George Soros is a noted supporter of liberal causes. He's the one that the people on the right wing love to hate. This woman I mentioned from Georgia, who believed there was a Jewish space laser starting forest fires. She attributed the ownership of the space laser to George Soros. It's another way of being anti-Semitic without, it's like calling someone a person of color without using the N word. This is a way of demonstrating your anti-Semitism by raising the specter of George Soros. Well, you can see that there are lots of billionaires on the right supporting things. Sheldon Adelson, Chaim Saban, who happen to be Jews, Paul Singer, Klarman, etc. The ones in bold print in the billionaires are hedge fund managers. So if somebody could explain to me what a hedge fund manager does, I'd be interested, because I have no idea, other than they manage other people's money and take a percentage of it. And I think they probably have rigged the stock market. They've gamed the system. So basically they make money and small investors don't. And we have this thing going on now with GameStop, where it's the hedge fund managers versus small investors who have gotten together on social media to, I don't know, I haven't, unfortunately didn't invest at the right time in GameStop. Had I had a couple of weeks ago, I'd probably be on my yacht in the Caribbean right now, but here I am in the frozen tundra of Pennsylvania. So you had billionaires on both sides. You had billionaires for and against, and you had other billionaires who were, it was kind of hard to say what they were doing, but all of these people use their money to influence government policy, including foreign policy. In organizations, you had think tanks, you had non-governmental organizations, you had religious groups for the deal, and you had the same a number of different kinds of groups against the deal. One of the things that you should not think is that think tanks think. Think tanks have become one more weapon in the battle for influence over policy in Washington. And so you originally started off in the 1920s with the Council on Foreign Relations, and then you had a couple other the Brookings Institution, and then about somewhere along the way in the 1950s, I think, the conservatives said, we don't like these think tanks. They say they're nonpartisan, but they keep coming up with these liberal, progressive ideas. So we need a right-wing think tank to come up with right-wing ideas, conservative talking points, conservative studies. That great Western philosopher Stephen Colbert once said, reality has a known liberal bias. And so to weigh in against that reality, you had right-wing think tanks, the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, et cetera. And now you can identify them, and they don't make any secret of this. And some of the left-wing think tanks, more recent ones, have said, we're here to argue against the right-wing think tanks. And you have libertarian think tanks too. You probably have more libertarian think tanks than you have libertarians, because a lot of these very rich billionaires believe the solution to every problem is less government. And so if they could only get rid of government regulation, those billionaires think they would be even richer. And so because they think they'll never be rich enough, they want to basically get rid of government. So they bankroll think tanks. There's one called the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian think tank. And then, of course, the other people that can influence policy are individuals. And you can write your congressman. I once had this conversation. I visited the National Ombudsman in Peru. It was a new office that had just been created. And so I went to visit the first person that had been appointed to the job. And we had a nice chat in his office. And when we came out, he was walking me to my car, and there was a long line outside his office in Lima. And I said, are all these people here for human rights violations and things like that? And he said, no, they're here because their Social Security check didn't arrive, or they had a problem with some government agency. And I said, wow, in the United States, you would write your congressman and expect your congressman to help you with that problem. And he kind of looked at me and with, understanding my ignorance, and said, write your congressman does not translate into Spanish. So, but in the United States, you can write. So some of again, you had a lot of different groups and organizations on both sides of the Iran nuclear issue. AIPAC is a well-known pro-Jewish lobby, right-wing, J Street is a pro-Israel lobby that's progressive. And so it's sort of like if one group has success in Washington, there'll be a group created to oppose it, to fight for to affect policy. So I won't go through each of these, but and you even had different groups telling the other groups how to use social media to make their arguments. What tactics did they use? They used anything they could to influence public opinion, congressional opinion, and presidential opinion. Grassroots petitions, letters, calls to congressmen, and of course, validators. You had a list of rabbis in favor of the deal and a list of rabbis against, or taking out newspaper ads. You had generals and diplomats for the deal, generals and diplomats against, and again, advertising as a way of trying to influence public opinion. And then, of course, you need to raise funds to keep going. This was just a list of things. You had professional lobbyists that I meant to look it up to see who India has as its lobby. There's something called the Foreign Agents Registration Act, where lobbyists who lobby for foreign governments have to register with the Treasury Department, and the Treasury Department puts that information online. And every country pretty much in Washington that wants to influence policy usually hires a lobbyist to do that, and they do all kinds of things like web services, drafting documents and statements, etc., all designed to influence policy. So I think the result is that the Iran nuclear deal, because of its high profile, was one of those classic battles that the foreign policy makers, the foreign policy implementers, and the foreign policy influencers, there's some overlap there between these groups, but they don't approach the issue in the same way. You have the president, the Congress, and the bureaucracy are involved, but you can have any number of outside groups. Most foreign policy issues get made behind the scenes because they're so boring or they don't affect anybody that and there's so much of it that it's kind of the routine business of government. But for that issue, which becomes has a high public profile, the media seizes on it, then you get all of these other groups potentially involved, and it can be very messy and protected. And so that's why I think no foreign policy theory of international relations is going to explain it. So let me just say that Senator Inhofe, he's a senator from Oklahoma. He's such a brilliant observer of the world that he once went onto the floor of the Senate with a snowball and said, look here, the people say that climate change is happening and there's global warming, but I've got a snowball here that proves that it's not happening. That's the kind of intellect Senator Inhofe has. But he's recently said, we don't want Biden going back into the nuclear deal that Obama signed, Trump withdrew from, Biden wants to get back into. Inhofe says Iran has to stop funding terrorists. We have to let Israel and all the Arab countries have a veto power over whether we get back into the deal. The deal has to be permanent, no time limits. It has to allow for unlimited inspections. In other words, in order to achieve a new deal, it must be impossible to achieve a new deal because Iran is not going to agree to any of that. It wasn't in the original deal, and it's not going to be in the next one. Would that even satisfy anybody? I don't think so. There's something called the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, which is a nice sounding name, but It's the foundation funded by right-wing billionaires for overthrowing governments we don't like. And what will President Biden do? He's got a problem because the arms embargo that was part of the deal has ended. You still have restrictions because of Iran's military missile testing and terrorist groups. You've got Iran holding presidential elections this year, which always makes it difficult. You've got regional tensions. You've got President Biden yesterday announced that we were not going to support the war in Yemen anymore, support Saudi Arabia's ability to wage war in Yemen, which is a struggle between a proxy struggle between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It's unfortunately taking place in Yemen. You have Israel saying, no, you can't go back into the deal, but the options are the same. You either, when you have a problem, you either take the Iraq model, invade, or at least continue coercive measures like economic sanctions. You can take the North Korea model, where you fall in love with a dictator, as Donald Trump did, and basically ignore the problem, or you can negotiate. One of the other problems, of course, now is, this is from a 1908 cartoon called Alphonse and Gaston, where they were excessively polite to each other, and one was saying, oh, you go first, Alphonse. No, you go first, Gaston. So that's where we are at the moment with Iran. Iran says the United States has to take steps to get back into the deal, and the United States is saying, no, Iran has to go first. So whether we ever get, I think we'll get back into it, but it again will be subject to great debate and lots of pulling and tugging and etc. So that is basically the presentation. So I'd welcome any questions or comments you have.
Thank you, Ambassador Jett, for such a thought-provoking presentation. It was really a complex. Of course, to me, it was very complex because you touched down on a lot of issues which is shaping American foreign policy. Personality, actors, state agencies, institutions, corporations, media houses, pressure groups, lobbyists, it's a whole range of actors. So it's really a complex issue on which you chose to speak, and it was really very thought-provoking, and I hope students will learn a lot on the contingencies of foreign policy making and the risk that the policymakers wage to formulate policies. So what I would do, I would take up some questions from the students. So Gini Rajvanshi, one of our students, asked a question. Respected sir, as Iran recently called on the new US administration to unconditionally lift sanctions imposed by Donald Trump on the Islamic Republic to salvage the 2015 nuclear deal, warning against any concessions. So how do you respond to this comment? And do you think any negotiation would be possible?
Well, I think negotiations are possible, but I think it's going to be difficult. And again, you've got one side saying you go first, and the other side saying, oh no, you go first. It would be nice just to say, okay, we're going back to the status quo ante. We're going back to the deal as it was, but Iran has taken steps. They've increased the number of centrifuges. They've increased the amount of enriched material that they're holding. I believe that it will be possible to negotiate something, but it's a very complicated deal, and it's not going to be easy. But I hope it happens because I think it does give you the confidence that Iran is not using its program to develop nuclear weapons. And Trump always said, well, I'm going to apply maximum pressure, and they're going to basically Iran will be on its knees and will do anything I want. I always remember, I think it was the Prime Minister of Pakistan who said, my people will eat grass if that's what's required to obtain nuclear weapons. And so I don't know that Iranians are going to be eating any grass, but they have their own national pride and their own priorities and agenda. So I don't know that you're going to be able to force Iran and of course, Israel likes to threaten a military attack as a seeming way of forcing Iran to do what they wanted to do. But there are at least 14 nuclear sites in Iran, some of them buried in mountains, and Iran is not next door to Israel. It's at least 1,000 kilometers from Tehran to Jerusalem. And so the Israeli military is formidable, but also Israel is a country of 7 million people, if you include the 1.5 million Israeli Arabs. Iran is a country of 70 million people. So it's I think more than Israel could handle. And of course, they'd look to the United States to support them. So, but it's possible, but it's not going to be easy. You're muted.
Yourself. Please unmute yourself.
Sorry. So one of our students, Kushveer, asked a question: why would a country like Iran, situated in such a dense region, will want to curb its nuclear program so that to put its sovereignty under continuous threat, like by taking analogy from India's nuclear program, which enhanced its nuclear program as a result of its so-called nuke-enriched neighbors continuously posing threat to its sovereign territory?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, that's the fundamental question of nuclear weapons. Do nuclear weapons make you safer? Is India safer because it has nuclear weapons? Well, I guess you could argue, well, Pakistan has nuclear weapons. But wouldn't both countries be better off if neither country had them? Right now, nobody in the Middle East has nuclear weapons except Israel, and obviously Israel would use them for defensive purposes. They're not going to, again, a country of 7 million people is not going to decide to attack other countries in an offensive kind of way. And of course, given Israel's history, they have real concerns about being attacked. But if Iran gets nuclear weapons, then you can set your watch, because it's going to take about 10 minutes for Saudi Arabia to get nuclear weapons. And then if Saudi Arabia gets nuclear weapons, all those other Gulf states with lots of oil money are going to start acquiring them as well. And so at the end of the day, you're going to have a whole lot of money spent on nuclear weapons, and it's not going to make the region safer. It's going to be another situation like India and Pakistan, where you hope one day that the people who control those weapons don't lose control and start a nuclear confrontation, because it would be horrific, particularly in countries that have a heavy dependence on agriculture. As I think I saw yesterday in the New York Times, there are farmers in India who are protesting even as we speak. And so if you had a nuclear exchange, not only would the cities be targeted, but you would have dust clouds that would block the sun, that would not increase the crop yields. And so you'd have the initial exchange of nuclear weapons, and then hundreds of millions of more people would die in the weeks to come because agriculture would fail. So I don't know that you can make the argument that nuclear weapons would make any country safer, and it certainly wouldn't make Iran safer.
I was wondering, and this is my question, I mean, more than a question, I want to understand this phenomenon. Is this partisan politics in United States in shaping American foreign policy is a result of competing political ideologies between the liberals and Democrats, or it's more about personality clash of actors? Or is there any serious commitment to political ideologies across political lines in shaping foreign policy in the United States?
Yeah, good question. I would say, one easy way to answer that question is to say it's all of the above. It's kind of driven by the issue, and it's driven by personalities. Mr. Modi and Mr. Trump seem to get along. We'll see if Mr. Biden and Mr. Modi get along. So sometimes it's the personalities of leaders. Sometimes it's you can have, you've got 435 congressmen and 100 senators, which is a lot of people. But if a senator or a congressman takes up a particular issue, they can attempt to influence the policy with regard to that issue if they want to devote the energy and the time to that issue. You had a congressman named Charlie Wilson who wanted to make sure the Mujahideen had American weapons to defeat the Russians in Afghanistan. And so he was able to direct billions of dollars in weapons to Afghanistan that probably otherwise wouldn't have gone there. And so there was a Stephen Solars, a congressman several years ago, who was I think he was Jewish and certainly pro-Israel, who was very anti-Pakistan. And so he was able to push policy in that regard. So it can be a mix of things, and you'd have to look at each issue and see who was weighing in and what their motivation was, stated or real.
This leads to my second question, just a further interrogation, which I want to understand. Then where does it places Francis Fukuyama's contention that it's end of ideology, whether with the West in the East or within the Americas itself, and the liberal ideology in a way has won over all the other competing political ideologies? So do you see a shift between the kind of liberalism that Republicans would hold on to or the Democrats would hold on to in terms of thinking about foreign policies?
Yeah, I mean, Fukuyama's book, the end of history. I guess one thing to keep in mind is human progress is not linear. It's not always one step forward followed by another step forward followed by another step forward. It's steps to the side and step backwards. As you probably detected, I'm no fan of President Trump, so I think we've spent the last 4 years going backwards as a country. And I'm also no fan of the Republican Party today, which has become a party of QAnon and conspiracy theories and racism and xenophobia, and it has been for a long time. It used to be the Democrats that was the party of racism up until Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, and when he was the president. And when he did, he turned to his young staff aide, Bill Moyers, and said, "We've just lost the South," meaning the Confederacy, the slave states, "for a generation." Well, he's being optimistic because the South still votes solidly Republican, and I with exceptions, as we saw in Georgia, with not the congresswoman I mentioned, but both the senators now from Georgia were won by Democrats. So it depends on the party and how they motivate their most loyal voters, the usually before a presidential election, the two parties publish their platform, which is basically their philosophy and what they intend to do if they take the presidency. This last time around, the Republicans didn't even publish a platform. They said, "Oh, we did one in 2016. It's the same one for 2020." Well, I think that's because when the policy is made by tweet, and the tweet can be one thing one day and something else the next day. So you just wonder where the Republican Party is these days. Of course, that doesn't mean that the Democrats are going to succeed or be united, but maybe they will be, maybe they won't be.
So Professor Stephen Barnes has raised a question, and this is the last question that we are taking for the session. There are a lot of students who have raised questions. I'm sorry to them. So the question that Professor Barnes raised is Ambassador Jett commented on the influence of money, billionaires, corporations, individuals on foreign policy. Example, foreign policy with Iran. A question for Dr. Kunal Kishore, what about India? That money also impact foreign policy decisions in Indian foreign policy. Is there an analogous foreign policy debate / issue in India?
Well, obviously, it's not the only thing. Money is not the only thing. I mean, if you can mobilize grassroots supports, Black Lives Matter, for instance, I don't think there's a lot of money behind Black Lives Matter. It's just a public concern about structural racism and the outrage at policemen killing Black men mainly because they're Black. And so, you know, it's not the only thing. Anything that affects politicians, and the things that affect politicians, of course, politicians, when they want to keep their job, they want to attract votes and they want to attract money. And so usually it's the money that's more important because they can use the money to advertise and to get votes. But if there's a groundswell of public sentiment, then as I assume that's what's happening with the farmers in India right now. It's not that there's a lot of money behind it. It's that the farmers in India think that they deserve better conditions and higher prices for their crops. I'm not sure what the issue is.
To add one point, Professor Barnes, I think we are moving towards US in terms of seeing election as an event, and the kind of money that we see coming in and making elections expensive, the last two general elections. So yes, there is a lot of similarity, the way elections are fought in India, looking at the last two general elections. So yes, there's a big money involved. The money involved in elections is huge. And that goes into lobbyism of policies. And so we are moving in that direction. Pressure groups would have a larger role to play. The corporate houses such as FICCI, ASSOCHAM, and other corporate houses and associations would have a much larger role to play. So yes, there is, and now just to add another point in terms of recent amendment to the electoral bonds, I mean, yes, there would be a lot of role of corporate organizations in financing the elections. So yes, big money is involved here also in elections.
Yeah, well, I hope you don't follow our example, but I think that we have not been able to figure out how to reduce the impact of money. There are discussions periodically on public funding of elections, but then people will say, oh, I don't want to pay my taxes to have my taxes go to supporting elections. So instead they pay more money for their prescription drugs or whatever it is, rather than pay in tax. I guess the best thing one could do, not the best thing, but is just insist on transparency. So at least you know where the money is coming from and who is trying to buy influence, and you can then figure out why and what their objective is.
I'm always fascinated by Tocqueville's book, Democracy in America. And I think that really brings some fond memories of the rise of democracy in America. And it gives us a sense of hope to reread the vision of democracy in America. So in that sense, we are really, enamored by the kind of debate and the enthusiasm that Tocqueville showed in the 19th century in American democracy. So we have not lost all hope. Just to
Well, we haven't either. Since January 20th, our hope has been, at least my hope has been renewed. Not some other people have opposite opinion, but I think it shows, and I think it demonstrates the fundamental fact that democracy is like a muscle. You either exercise it and it gets stronger, or you don't exercise it and it gets weaker.
So now I invite Priyanshi Dutch for vote of thanks, and then after we would conclude the program. But in the meanwhile, before Priyanshi comes in, I would like Professor Purvi Pokhriyal, our Dean and Director, to thank our esteemed.
Yeah. Thank you, Kunal.
Ambassador.
Thank you, Professor Ambassador Jett, on behalf of the entire university, faculty, and students fraternity. We really would like to thank you. It was such an enriching discussions. We could parallelly see the Indian picture when you're talking about the US issues. Thank you so much. It is really well received by all of us, and we look forward to, as we discussed the other day, we look forward to have you and invite you on campus when the situation around us gets settled. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Again, it's been a pleasure with you. I look forward to being with you, and I'll bring my Iran book as well as my peacekeeping book when I come. So you'll have them for your library.
Thank you.
So I think we should conclude, since I think our student representation representative is not here, but we extend heartfelt thanks for sparing a time, and you already mentioned that you have a family dinner to attend. So wish you all the best for the dinner. And thank you so much for sparing such a valuable time of yours. And apart from that, I personally learned a lot today on what goes into making a foreign policy and what kind of risk, again, I'm saying, a foreign policy maker wages. So it really takes a lot of courage and heart to speak about the intricate matters of foreign policy. Thank you so much, Ambassador Dennis Jett. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you again. All the best.
Thank you. Have a great time ahead. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Judge Mel. Thank you, Hedge. Thank you. Bye-bye.